Even before the pandemic struck, we were all riding this digital wave, having conversations about how to keep customers engaged and employees productive. Now, almost 2 years into the pandemic, as we learn to live with constant disruption, those conversations are getting really interesting. And increasingly, customer and employee experience have become a cross-functional responsibility. I'm Leandro Perez, Vice President of Marketing for Salesforce Asia Pacific, and I'm excited to be hosting the Salesforce Executive Conversation Series, where we talk to Salesforce global executives on their thoughts, perspectives, and experience working with thought leaders and the C-suite across the globe. We've had so many incredible conversations. If you've missed an episode, you can catch up at sfdc.co/conversations. Today, I'm talking with Salesforce Vice President of Product Marketing, Nathan Barling. Apart from being an accomplished musician, Nathan has both CTO and CMO credentials. He's also worked client-side and agency side. So he presents that perfect blend of super marketing smarts and technology evangelism. Asking him about data and, well, you've been warned. But seriously, great to have you, Nathan. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me today.
So look, where are you tuning in from? That is probably the best background I've seen in this whole pandemic time that I've been on calls with folks. Where are you tuning in from today?
I am tuning in from Dallas, Texas. And I think everybody kind of merged their background a bit since the pandemic started. So often most people think that it's just like a standard background that just comes with Zoom or something. So all my work goes, for nothing.
No, that's incredible. Well, look, let's just start off and hopefully our audience can get to know you a little bit before we jump into the main questions. So clearly music has been a big part of your life, looking at that background there. What was some of your favorites growing up?
Probably The Cure was really big growing up. My mother took me to see Journey when I was really young, and I still remember that concert very vividly. One of my earlier concerts, actually, my mother took me to as well, which was AC/DC, which was, probably not a concert a 7-year-old normally goes to see, but it was definitely something that was memorable.
Wow, that's amazing. I definitely did not have that experience. I have to talk about that another time for sure. And how do you, during this time, maybe you've changed this technique, but how do you relax after a long day at work or maybe when the week's winding down?
I actually walk my dogs every day, regardless of the weather. We had a blizzard here last year and I was still walking them. So I typically go out about 4:30 in the morning. So I start my day that way to kind of center myself.
That is an early start for sure. It's kind of coffee barista hours there. So tell me, if someone had to ask you what you did and maybe they weren't in the industry and they're not in tech, how would you describe what you do every day?
I often talk about building strategies for companies to reach people, because I think so often people talk about, how can we drive consumer loyalty? And I often talk about how brands can be more loyal to consumers. And I think I'm a huge advocate around data privacy and user privacy and how brands can have a more transparent relationship. So I talk a lot about that, is about the importance of how brands can kind of coexist with their customers.
So let's get straight into the data conversation with the question about the big topic of today, our cookieless future. What does that mean? Who's doing it? And why are they doing it?
This is an interesting question, and it's definitely a topic that every company I talk to wants to discuss. It's a little bit different than when GDPR and some of the other kind of data privacy regulations were passed, which had a lot to do with how you store data or how you can use data. What's really going on now is this shift where Google and Apple are changing the way that privacy exists across the ecosystem. And it's not regulations about that data, it's the data no longer exists at all. Data that was passed to marketers for years is no longer even there. And marketers are kind of been left to kind of scurry around to really kind of adjust to that. And it really kind of started last year when Apple made their change across their ecosystem where they were no longer going to support third-party cookies by default. And for those that may not know, third-party cookies are a bit of code that you put on your website, right? A Facebook pixel or a LiveRamp pixel or a Google pixel. And when people visit your site, you would be able to kind of simply track them around the internet. I could do things like, you come to nathanshoes.com and view a pair of shoes. And as you kind of go around the internet, that pair of shoes would kind of haunt you ad to ad, right? And retargeting that use third-party cookies, or marketing effectiveness, or things like audience building or lookalike modeling, which is I would take a whole group of, cookies from different users and say, hey, find me people like this, or householding or device graphing and all sorts of different things. But effectively, they were used to better understand the effectiveness of marketing, target users, and find new users. And when they made that change in 2020, the entire kind of way that people had to market to the iPhone all of a sudden changed. A lot of the user identification and the way that they were acquiring that data had to go, had to kind of go the way of the dodo and really change the way that they did everything. And then Google kind of responded in kind by saying, hey, we're going to roll out a similar change across Chrome. And it's created waves across the industry. And a lot of, it was originally supposed to go live in 2021. Then they kind of delayed it. Then it was slated to go live in 2022, and it was delayed again. And then finally, it really settled on 2023. They've invited EU and UK data regulators into the conversation to oversee this change. And Google has already kind of agreed that this change is going live. So, the common theme has really been that privacy is a fundamental human right. That's what the team at Apple has said time and time again. And that it's up to marketers to adapt to be effective without being invasive. So across all of these changes, that has been that common theme. So if you fast forward to 2021, early in that year, Apple made another kind of massive change, which was, after they undid some of that audience tracking and some of that digital marketing tracking, they focused their attention on mobile app tracking. So on every single Apple device, be it an iPad or an iPhone, also Android devices, there's a unique ID, and it's pretty much like a cookie. And what that ID is used for, that mobile ID is used for, is delivering ads, delivering retargeting ads, understanding effectiveness, audience building. You kind of get the theme, right? It was kind of a mobile cookie. And on that Apple ecosystem, it was called an IDFA, an ID for advertisers. And it had existed since advertising existed on iPhones. Apple made a change in 2021 that anybody that attempted to use that ID now had to ask permission. And you've all probably seen the prompt. If you have an iPhone, it said, Nathan Shoes would like permission to track you across apps and websites owned by other companies. This data will be used to personalize ads to you. Well, the reality is there's no real value in it for me to do that, which is why we're seeing globally about 85% of the users are opting out of that, right? And in the States, it's even higher. It's close to 90%. So all of a sudden, marketers that had based their entire marketing strategy on having access to this aggregate level behavioral data or content consumption data, all of a sudden were left completely unprepared. Peloton in 2021 didn't hit their new customer growth targets, right? Their revenue numbers didn't hit what they expected. And they attributed that to Apple, in part because they had used different sorts of beacons and different sort of intent signals that were being fired from people using apps. And all of that was being blended into these behavioral profiles. And they were using that to know better when people were leaning into fitness and possibly willing to start to buy some of their kind of appliances. And all of a sudden, they lost access to all of that data. And then if you jump even further into Q3 2021, that's when Apple made that same change to email. Email marketers for years have been able to put a small image, a one-by-one transparent image in emails, where every time someone opened up that email, they could understand the device, where they were located, how frequently they opened it up. They could control and better understand how to deliver dynamic content in emails, all based on having access to that information. And this data was being collected often without really the knowledge of users. So Apple rolled out in September of 2021 the ability for users to opt in on what they called mail privacy protection. And what mail privacy protection effectively did was strip out all of those email trackers. It removed all direct communication from the person checking the email in their Apple Mail client and that web server and that email server. And effectively what it did is all of a sudden turned the light off of all kind of information being sent about open rates, the frequency of open rates, the engagement. It started to undermine some of our open time optimization rules. And all of a sudden an industry that had been completely based on that type of information had to all of a sudden kind of pivot. And that's often what's happening with these privacy changes is they're not waiting for brands to deploy a strategy to fix it. Marketers were given about 8 weeks, less than 8 weeks to say, hey, your email program has to change radically. And that was it. And the same thing goes with all the rest of these privacy initiatives is they're giving a cutoff date of when these things are coming, and prepared or not, they're going live. And then ultimately we're going to have to make those adjustments.
These are huge changes, and I guess one that's going to affect every business, really. So as a person with your head totally in this space, what are your recommendations for offsetting these changes?
Yeah, and that's the big shift that you're going to see is I think historically we've all become so, reliable on third-party data. Data provided from publishers, data provided from list managers or ID vendors, right? Or device graph vendors, where we could use all of these third-party signals as the foundation for what we do. I think it was easy, right? And especially when you were moving into new spaces or new categories, it was very easy for the larger companies to kind of buy access to that data. And what we're really seeing now in this new kind of age of privacy is a change where first-party data is king, right? Google, which is the largest third-party data company in the world, said first-party relationships are vital to the future of marketing, right? Are vital. And when the largest third-party data vendor says that, we should probably listen, right? And that's where we see this massive shift where brands of all sizes are now hyper-focused on how do we build first-party relationships. Data that we control, data that we own, data that we transparently kind of discuss with our customers, and ultimately show them, the customers, that there's value in sharing that data. We recently did consumer research and saw that 7 out of 10 customers said they were willing to share the personal data as long as there was some value in it for them. Well, how do brands do that? They do it through rewards programs and loyalty programs and incentives and different kinds of things like that. But ultimately, it's up to the brands to show customers and earn the right to that first party or zero party data, right? Zero party data is a new term that some of you may have never heard of before. It's data I willingly share with a brand for you to use that to market or personalize my experience, right? So how do I earn that as a consumer? And that is where brands really are at a crossroads, where they've never really had to build a first party relationship, especially consumer goods brands and those that often are kind of disconnected from that end consumer. They're kind of rapidly shifting their strategies to hyper-focus on first-party, build a first-party repository, shift my work from DMP to CDP, right? One is based, DMPs were based on third-party cookies, CDPs are based on first-party profiles, and then ultimately use that as the foundation for my analytics and my acquisition and ultimately my experiences.
Wow, so you've mentioned some incredible things. And I love that shift from DMP to CDP because it's quite clear, third party to first party. So explain to me, so you mentioned, and I love that value of exceptional, customer experience, how to deliver value. That's something we've been talking at Salesforce for a very long time. Can you share any examples of organizations that are doing this or that have shown that they're able to do this in a great way?
Absolutely. It's an interesting when you start to focus on which brands in the space, right? Fins and retail have endless first-party data, right? They have intent data and signal data and category and browsing, but how do you use that to unlock the value, right? How do you start to build that, experience to the customer where we're memorable? And where we've really started to see a shift are brands starting to create content that's purpose-built to build relationships. So here in the States, there's a retailer called Mattress Firm, and Mattress Firm owns a chain of all over the United States, and they sell mattresses and sheets and other bedwear, right? What they've really focused on is delivering sleep.com. And what sleep.com is about is it's a content site on creating shareable articles and shareable bits of content that's designed to promote healthier sleep. How do you sleep better? How do you sleep better when you travel? The 10 tips of healthy sleeping, sleep trackers, possibly into meditation and those kinds of things to promote a healthier sleep. But what it's also doing is building a first party relationship with that customer, right? You look at Under Armour's acquisition of Map My Run, right? Which is a very fairly disconnected app, right? And that's something that we're starting to see. You look at the NFL or the NBA, which are sports entertainment, their partnerships. So they're using, if you think about like the NFL, which is an American Football League, they're much like a consumer goods brand. They don't have tons of direct relationship with their viewers. So what they've been doing is leveraging partnerships to acquire access to that data. I was recently watching an NFL game on Peacock, which is one of the major NFL broadcasters here. And midway through the game, I got a pop-up on my Fire Stick that says, "Is it okay for us to share your data with the NFL?" My son got that when he was installing Madden, the video game, on his PS5. Asked him if he was okay to share all of his play data and favorite teams and his IP address and home address and every bit of information you could possibly think of. But that's just some of the different ways that we've seen kind of brands start to leverage that, is through a combination of apps, content, relationships, incentives, and then ultimately partnerships.
Fascinating, and thanks for sharing those examples. I don't know, on sleep.com, hopefully you're getting great sleep now if you've read their information. So let's unpack that. You mentioned some of those kind of, probably some people might say scary examples where a child is getting asked questions like this. How do you get this data then, and how do you make it in a way that's not creepy? So what's changed about data collection in this new world, or any recommendations there?
You know, you have to earn access to data, right? And if you're not showing the customer that there's value in it for them, they'll just not share it. Honestly, when they asked me about my data sharing to the NFL, I said no, because there was nothing in it for me, right? It was just, hey, can we have all of your personal data so I can target you? That's not value. Delivering an ad is not a relationship. Right? And relationships are what earns access to data. Showing that it's valuable, showing that you understand them as customers, showing that you can be relevant without being creepy, not asking for 1,000 bits of data, asking for the data that can help shape and improve their experience with the brand, right? So, and then not asking for it all at one time. If it's the first time the customer's been to your site, don't ask them for, everything about the history of their, of their purchasing patterns, but asking them, having a kind of combination of affinities, right? Stated affinities of things that I tell you I like and my preferences and the kinds of products that I like, but also how can I then blend that with some of the intent data that I'm showing, right? The ad that I click on, right? You can know a lot about me simply by what ad brought me to your site. Right, I can understand the themes, the types of things that are resonating with me, the overarching kinds of content of the creative, maybe even the publisher. All of those things should be used to deliver an experience that is very relevant without necessarily having to ask me anything. And that's ultimately where we see this blend, is earning the right to data, and then over time doing that by asking single questions during journeys. Like, hey, is this the kind of content that you like to see? Do you play tennis a lot? Do you enjoy the NFL? Do you want to see more vegetarian cuisine? Those kinds of single thumbs up, thumbs down questions are becoming kind of a trained behavior with consumers in terms of how we deliver reviews and how we give intent signals. Incorporate those into email campaigns, incorporate those into journeys and triggered moments on your site, and the customers will lean in because they feel less protective of that data, especially if you can show that giving you that data will ultimately deliver a better experience for them.
Yeah, no, I love that concept of value and relationships. It all sounds very human, right? Which I think is where we're heading back to. Maybe the pendulum is swinging from all the AI chatbots kind of relationships that some of these companies have leaned into because they bring efficiencies. So we've been talking about some B2C examples, and I know, we're in B2B, some of our audience might be in B2B, and it's kind of the reason why we launched Salesforce Plus, which is to start building content for our audience. Any advice that you would give to the folks tuning in that, maybe a little bit different between B2B and B2C in this space?
Sure. It's interesting. I'd say like 15 years ago, the strategies for B2B and B2C were radically different, right? Now we're delivering ads on the same publishers. We're sending things the same way, where our channels are the same. And I think especially after pandemic, as everything's become kind of a hybrid workspace, right? Where it's kind of work from anywhere and succeed from anywhere. It's really kind of come down to volume, right? B2C kind of have this massive volume pool, right? And they're doing the same activities. They're just doing it at a much larger scale, which means the B2B interactions are more impactful, right? Are more meaningful because you don't have like as much of an opportunity to err, I guess, right? So what we often say is, as you're working with your B2B clients and you start to shift to an account-based modeling approach or account-based marketing approach, it means I know in a B2B space, it's often not a decision that I'm going to make in one day, right? I talked to a B2B customer just the other day that they have a 3-year purchase cycle, which is massive. What it is really, though, it's a 3-year cycle that's really paired together with a whole bunch of different moments, right? Strategy's the same. Analytics are the same. But rather than looking at one just conversion, they're really looking at a whole bunch of connected moments that lead to a conversion. So there's massive opportunities, but what will happen is you may see at one time a trigger journey will lead you to call the customer, or maybe it's a face-to-face meeting, or it's a webinar, or it's some bit of content. So as you start to look at how we can connect all those moments, personalization becomes radically important. Right? Because if I know you're looking at a particular product and you've done about 8 of the 15 different kind of connected moments, we want to make sure that your experience is relevant and hyper relevant. So they don't have to feel like they have to continue down the same cycle. The kinds of content, the kinds of marketability, the kinds of everything that rolls into that overall story needs to overlap and really connect. So with B2B, I'd say it's the same. But every one of those moments is probably even more important because of that, right? Or multiple stakeholders in a decision, right? That's not something that my shoe company has to think about, right? B2B companies do. So that sort of kind of shared value system and shared kind of story becomes incredibly important, which is why having a single source of truth, not only for that customer, but also for that brand becomes very, very important, which is why you'll start to see more and more kind of CDP brand with B2B focus on that particular kind of technology.
Wow, I'm just going to adjust my collar here. I'm sweating a little bit. You're saying moments that matter, Nathan. B2B stakes are high, right? And so, you've got so much pressure to have those right moments, but over a long period of time, like 3 years is an aggressive example, but long sales cycles in B2B an example. And it just means we've always got to be on in the marketing department, that's for sure, which kind of leads to my next question. Who is going to lead this change? Is it a marketer? Is it a CEO? Is it a new title that, a CDO or something that doesn't exist yet? Where do you see this change going, and who owns it?
So I see this single source of truth of customer being a cross-organizational capability, and it has to be a focus for everyone, right? Because 1 in 3 customers say it only takes one bad experience to walk away from a brand, even a brand they love. Right? Think about how many touch points, just in my shoe example, right? You bought a pair of shoes from my e-com, right? Think about how many different teams go into ensuring that you have a positive experience. My merchandising team, my purchasing team, my fulfillment, my order system, my technology system. You can see all the various different bits of organization that touch that customer journey, right? That interact with that customer in various different ways. If there's an issue, customer satisfaction, order management, messaging, re-messaging after the fact, right? There's a million different things we have to think about. So having just one focus as a group, just saying it's a marketing problem, I think that's kind of an old world way of thinking. And I'm seeing a lot of the brands, especially enterprise brands, really almost creating councils of sorts where they understand the role of this technology and how it can underpin and become the foundation for this new data culture in the brand. You will see things like chief digital officer, chief data officer, chief revenue officer, right? That starts to blend sales and marketing a little bit more together. But ultimately what it really is how do you start to build a data culture and make it be relevant to every group in the business? Make people understand the value of having that customer story and driving those customer experiences, and then personalize the data so that it's relevant to each of those stakeholders. I could have one profile of data and show 4 different people across my organization, but highlight what's important to them, and it becomes a system they want to use, not one that we're kind of mandating them to use, right? And I think long term, that's what we really want, is how do we start to personalize that data view so that everybody can use it at the same time and drive that ultimate customer experience? Because I think that in the future, it will be even more important than it is today in terms of driving loyalty. Because if you think about digital transactions as a whole, right? If this kind of shift of 40, 50% growth into digital space, if you were shopping in my shoe store and I was sitting here fitting shoes on your feet, my competitors aren't going to come in and start showing you that their product is cheaper, right? Or that their message is better, right? In the digital world, that happens every single day. So that customer experience becomes critically important to the sustained growth of any business. So I think as each of those kind of teams across the business starts to identify their role, they can then start to understand how valuable it is to them to have that access to that data.
So I guess what would be the last piece of advice you would give to folks that have tuned in today going, wow, I didn't know about this whole space. Now I know, like, how do I get started? What can they do to act now?
What's interesting is there's really 2 kinds of sides of that coin. The first one is if you have a bunch of first party data, right? Maybe it's in disparate systems. Maybe it's just not joined up in a way that can be unified into that single source of truth. I'd say focus on looking at how a CDP can help drive some of that, because that's going to align a lot of those systems together. It's going to start to build those records. And then what you can then say is, how do we start to drive experiences from it, right? Data is no longer enough, right? You can't just have data. Now you have to say, how do we unlock the value of that data and drive experiences and drive those moments that matter for our customers? So CDP is a great place to start. For a lot of us, though, we've used Google and Facebook and Amazon and LinkedIn data for a long time. So we don't have a lot of those first party relationships. So what you want to start to do is start to think through, how do we start to generate that? How do we start to create unknown to known users? How do we start to showcase and better communicate the value of our business? How do we start to better understand the types of customers that we're bringing in and what marketing campaigns are working more effectively? That sort of issue where you're trying to build that first party store, you're going to lean into things like loyalty, rewards programs, personalization platforms are really at the forefront of that. Also a marketing intelligence platform. On that way, you know very directly, if I pull this marketing lever, this is the kind of outcome. Because what that will start to then do is start to build up that kind of repository of first party users with zero party kind of data sprinkled on that. What then will allow you to really take advantage and really extract the most value from your CDP long term.
So if I were to summarize, I guess, our whole conversation, there is change that's definitely coming, you can't avoid it. And the change is going to impact us all, right? B2B, B2C, whether you're selling shoes all the way to some complicated piece of software. And I think what I'm hearing as well is that there is opportunities to develop relationships through, common interests with your audience and your customers, whether that be meditation, if you're selling mattresses, or advice in a particular area that you're dealing with. And there's some technology that can help you with that, but it's, I guess, at the end of the day, important that your C-suite can look at that data and know if it's working for them and make the tweaks and changes. And that it's not one-stop shop, right? It's a continual conversation and a relationship, because at the end of the day, to your examples before, you need to deliver value to that customer. So I think we've learned so much today, Nathan. I just want to thank you for sharing your advice. You're clearly a deep expert in this space, and I know many folks are probably going to have follow-up questions, so we'll help them connect with you. But thanks again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate your time.
Some really incredible conversations we're having in this series. If you want to learn more about these topics or watch more episodes, visit sfdc.co/conversations. So far, we've covered, amongst other things, customer loyalty as the new currency, inclusivity and collaboration in our new world, effective decision-making, and today we've had a look into the cookieless future. Thank you for tuning into our Executive Conversations. See you next time. Are we a wrap with Nathan? Yeah? And now I have to do all the cleanup. I think you're going to be all the rage in APAC next year when we release this, I'm just saying. I think every time I look at your background, all I'm going to remember is my 21st birthday where I dressed up as John Travolta in the suit there. I can just see him there. I'm like,
I'm in.